Hello and welcome to Humans of History, where we break down the personalities of historic figures. Here we look at their influences, their habits, their foibles. We try to understand what molded them as individuals and why they did what we remember them for. If you're interested in the minds of the people who left their mark on history, this channel's for you. Today we're profiling Francisco Pizarro. He was the conquistador of Peru, the Spanish mercenary turned governor, the regicidal explorer, and the destroyer of native peoples and cultures. Or at least, this is how he's remembered. He led the overthrow of the sprawling Incan Empire with under 200 men. He exploited a succession crisis and civil war between Inca brothers Atahualpa and Huascar, which had left the empire in complete chaos when Pizarro arrived. But who was Francisco Pizarro really? Before delving into Pizarro the man, let's get that flash biography in. 5 minutes, hit the clock. Pizarro was likely born in 1478 in the city of Trujillo, in the western region of Extremadura in Spain. He was the accidental offspring of a youthful fling between Captain Gonzalo Pizarro, a nouveau-riche petty nobleman, and a local peasant girl named Francisca González. He wasn't formally recognised by his father and likely spent most of his childhood with his mother's family, engaged in agricultural and domestic work. Near the age of 14, he would leave his native city to pursue a regional military career. Around 16, he would leave Spain to serve in the First Italian War, some historians say in his father's footsteps, most likely as some kind of page or assistant in Sicily and Calabria. He was one of many men of his generation enticed by prospects of wealth and glory in the New World. In 1502, he sailed to what was then Hispaniola, today Haiti in the Dominican Republic, with the colony's new governor, Nicolás de Obando. Pizarro would be at the forefront of the Spanish discovery of the Americas. He rose up the ranks in Hispaniola as a tight-lipped, stern foot soldier, earning himself the reputation as a skilled and loyal fighter. By 1509, he was Lieutenant General to the conquistador Alonso de Ojeda. Pizarro joined the Ojeda's expedition to Colombia, where the Spanish founded their first colony on the South American mainland, now the port city of Cartagena. Pizarro must have grown tired of the settler's life and no doubt the hostile and disease-ridden Caribbean coast. In 1513, he was with Vázquez Núñez de Balboa in the disastrous crossing of the Panamanian Isthmus. Pizarro was one of the few conquistadors who, after climbing a hilltop, became the first Europeans to see the Pacific Ocean in the distance. By 1519, Balboa had gone from the wealthy governor of Panama to a suspect for treason. The new governor, Pedro Arias de Ávila, tasked Pizarro with capturing the suspected traitor. He did so successfully and was rewarded with lands in Panama. Pizarro even became mayor of Panama until 1523. Around the same time, word went round among the Spanish conquistadors of a wealthy southern empire called Peru. And so it was that with the help of reputable commander Diego de Almagro and a wealthy priest named Hernando Luque, Pizarro would embark on an adventure that would change the course of history. While he would lead the expedition, Almagro and Luque remained behind in Panama for recruiting, funding, and planning general logistics. The three men made an oral pact to split equally all the spoils from any lands conquered. Pizarro and his comrades slogged across the Colombian coastline on two perilous expeditions between 1524 and 1528. After a particularly disastrous encounter with indigenous warriors in 1527, Pizarro and his men were forced to retreat to the island of Gallo, modern-day Colombia, where they waited for a ship from Panama with reinforcements and supplies. Instead, the ship arrived with orders from the governor to abandon the mission. It's at this point where Pizarro famously drew a line in the sand with his sword, inviting anyone who wished for glory and riches to cross it. The famous 13 who did cross the line accompanied him on his journey southward. When they reached the northernmost tip of Peru's modern-day coastline, stories of the great and rich empire grew ever more numerous, while generous gifts from local tribespeople revived the men's spirits. Since the governor of Panama still opposed the mission, Pizarro sailed back to Spain in 1528 to obtain a license for exploration and conquest from the Spanish crown. Pizarro returned to Panama in 1530, accompanied not only by 4 of his brothers, but with powers equivalent to those of a viceroy. He also had jurisdiction almost 700 miles south of Panama. Partners Almagro and Luque, meanwhile, were given lesser privileges. In December 1530, Pizarro and his men left Panama, landing on the coastline of modern-day Ecuador. After finding precious metals in abandoned settlements, they travelled south along the coast. The following year, in May 1532, the conquistadors moved inland, marching towards the centre of the Incan Empire. In August, Pizarro and his men founded the first Spanish settlement in Peru in the city of San Miguel de Piura, in modern-day Piura, Peru. The Inca Emperor Atahualpa, recently victorious from a civil war against his brother Huascar, sent emissaries to the Spanish party. He invited the mysterious, bearded men to the emperor's retreat in Cajamarca, where they arrived in November 1532. Atahualpa welcomed Pizarro and his men, but the Spanish massacred the Amerindians. Spanish gunpowder, swords, and horses guaranteed the conquistador's success, and Atahualpa was captured. The Inca sovereign paid a ransom for his release, 1 room of gold and twice over of silver. After a sham trial the following year, Atahualpa was executed. Without a leader, the Inca Empire dissolved. The Spanish sealed the conquest of Peru in November 1533 by entering a virtually defenseless Cusco. Pizarro spent the following years consolidating Spanish dominion over the lands of the former Inca Empire. Colonial institutions were set up, with an Incan puppet regime under the new heir to the throne, Manco Inca, the brother of Atahualpa and Huascar. Pizarro's followers earned titles and lands, and Pizarro was awarded the title of governor. He founded the city of Lima in 1535, then proclaimed as the City of Kings, its coastal location being more favourable to Spanish settlement. 2 years later, Inca soldiers loyal to Manco Inca besieged the new capital. The Inca also attacked Spanish-occupied Cusco in the 10-month siege of Cusco from May 1536 to March 1537. The conquest had created a rift between the Pizarro brothers and the men loyal to Diego de Almagro, who felt cheated of their fair share of lands, riches, and powers. The feud climaxed in the 1538 Battle of Las Salinas, not far from Cusco, from which the Pizarro brothers emerged victorious. Almagro was executed, and his men disbanded. In 1541, a splinter faction rallied around Almagro's son, seeking revenge, and on the 26th of June 1541, the conspirators assassinated Francisco Pizarro in his palace in Lima. It left a power vacuum, which would be filled by the first official viceroy of Peru in 1544. Mapping Pizarro's personality is no easy feat. He was illiterate, and our main sources are notarized documents, letters, testimonies, and of course, the Chronicle. Many of these, however, were not authored by eyewitnesses or even contemporaries. But you have to start somewhere, and where better than his formative years as a bastard from Extremadura? What happened in this man's early life that led him to overthrow one of the greatest civilizations of the pre-modern era? He was born the illegitimate son of Captain Gonzalo Pizarro, a newer member of the lesser nobility. He was an hidalgo of sorts who owned land and was exempt from taxation. The captain's house was most likely close to the main square, already a sign of some social prestige. Gonzalo would later acquire fame for his military exploits in the Italian wars as an artillery officer. Francisco's mother, Francisca González, was the daughter of peasants, believed to have worked in the local Franciscan convent as keepers of the wardrobes. Contemporary testimonies had it that he was deserted by his parents and left as a foundling on the doorstep of one of Trujillo's churches. One story offers a rather interesting spin of the Remus and Romulus myth, suggesting that baby Pizarro was suckled by a pig. We do know that Pizarro was born in the house of his maternal grandmother and that he spent much of his youth living with his mother's family. Though illegitimate birth in 16th century Spain was hardly uncommon, it determined Francisco's social standing. He would not inherit his father's title nor his land. He grew up having access to the captain's property, but it's unlikely he stayed there permanently. His father was in his early 30s when Francisco was born, with his military career ahead of him. He would only truly distinguish himself in the following decades, and until then was still a man of fairly moderate means. This and his disreputable dalliance with a peasant girl are likely reasons for distancing himself from Francisco in his youth. Unlike his half-brothers, who were all born at least 2 decades after himself, Francisco would receive no education, perhaps besides sword fighting and husbandry. He had no legal recognition and limited support from his father. Even Pizarro's name must have been chosen by his mother's half. All of Francisco's half-brothers had names predating them in the Pizarro lineage, but not his own. When Captain Gonzalo passed away in 1522, Francisco was the only son not to appear in his will. It's possible, because he was the oldest child and had been in the Americas for 20 years, that his father simply didn't know his whereabouts, or even if he was alive. Gonzalo could have wanted no legal trace of his bastard son to avoid tarnishing the family name. He may also only have wanted his legitimate offspring to inherit his fortune. Because of the age gap between Francisco and his half-brothers, it's unlikely he spent much time with, or even met, most of them before his return to Spain in 1529 to obtain the royal license. While the evidence suggests his mother enjoyed her drink and was quite possibly neglectful, Francisco's affinity for his mother's family would remain with him throughout his life. After the conquest, he would send them money. When he returned to Spain in 1529, he also sought out his half-brother, Francisco Martín de Alcántara, the legitimate offspring of Francisco González's later marriage, possibly arranged by Captain Pizarro in a public show of magnanimity. Martín would later become Pizarro's constant companion, crucial in the Peruvian expedition, and later the guardian of his children. Chroniclers and historians have said that Pizarro was a swineherd in his youth. There is, however, absolutely no evidence that this was the case. He likely worked as a labourer, engaged in some pastoral activity of some kind. Hog raising was one of the most widespread economic activities for people of all social standings in Trujillo. Some families even included 2 or 3 pig heads in their coat of arms. Pork was, after all, a dietary preference which clearly differentiated old Christians from their Muslim and Jewish neighbours after the reconquest of Iberia. It's completely plausible that the Pizarros were a pig-herding family. One of the main chronicles of the Peruvian conquest relates that in 1540, Hernando Pizarro led an expedition into the Peruvian Amazon, one which included some 3,000 to 5,000 pigs. Pigs are not native to the Americas, so if you consider the amount of logistical effort that went into importing and spreading these hogs, the Pizarros were probably quite the pig enthusiasts. And unlike his half-brothers, who would have been better educated, properly trained in sword fighting, and raised as nouveau riche nobility, Francisco could well have spent his early days in the fields, mountains, herding pigs, among other agricultural activities. If this is the case, he would no doubt have been strong from a young age, both mentally and physically. Obviously, you can't say that herding pigs gave him the expertise to topple the Incan Empire, even if the troops he was leading were swine, but an affinity and resilience to the outdoors couldn't have been totally useless. Something which certainly would have moulded the future conquistador was the well-known temperament of Extremadurans at the time. The records show that Trujillo was a tightly woven, isolationist community made up of a highly aggressive and domineering population. Any opportunity for personal gain was never missed through aggressive and persistent litigation, brute force, or both. Without delving too much into 15th century Extremadura and pigs again, fascinating though its porcine history may be, contemporary documents show a people that obsessed over the natural resources available for their beloved pigs. Trujilleños took pretty much anybody to court if they in some way, shape or form presented some challenge to their pig herding. Neighbours who'd cut acorn trees for timber, for example, would be branded as enemies, the acorn being a valuable source of nutrition for the pigs, and could see their fields and trails completely destroyed. It must come as no surprise that at least 17 of the 168 Europeans present at the time of the capture of Atahualpa were from Trujillo, and a further 19 were from other parts of Extremadura. Some of the most prominent conquistadors also hailed from Extremadura. Hernán Cortés, conqueror of Mexico, and even distant cousin to Pizarro, Francisco de Orellana, the main European explorer of the Amazon, Pedro de Valdivia, the first governor of Chile, and Vasco Núñez de Balboa, the aforementioned European discoverer of the Pacific Ocean. Pizarro was therefore a product of his environment, one which was known for producing tight-lipped, serious and grim men. Pizarro would inherit his father's ambition and even sought a military career to follow in his footsteps. He most likely worked in some minor assistance role in the Italian campaigns. Any experience on the continent would have given Pizarro an edge over his later comrades in the New World. Francisco's childhood moulded him. A young man caught between worlds, he would inherit from his parents a mixed character as a man of few words with a mild temperament but a combative and enduring spirit. One of Pizarro's biographers, Busto de Turburu, wrote that, quote, everything leads to the belief that Pizarro was an extremely rigid man, and the chronicles certainly seem to show it. He slept early, woke before dawn, and drank and ate sparingly. He was punctual for business and serious in his duties as both commander and governor. He rarely succumbed to emotional outbursts and was usually courteous with his men and fellow settlers. Despite a relatively plebeian upbringing, contemporaries say he carried himself like a nobleman and a commander. Terse and direct in his speech, his reasoning was persuasive, and there are few signs of any plebeian undertones to his speech or address. When he returned to Spain in 1529, Pizarro easily convinced the royal court that he was the man capable of overseeing the great expedition and obtained an extremely generous license. His dress sense points to an austere character. Contemporary chroniclers say that even when he was governor of Peru, he never wore extravagant clothing. Far from it, he would wear clothes that hadn't been in fashion for nearly half a century. These included a high-waisted black coat that fell down to the ankles, a white hat and white deerskin shoes, all apparently inspired by his father, Captain Gonzalo. Francisco only had one fur coat, a gift, which he only wore on special occasions. Unlike his father, who had a weak spot for the ladies and fathered over a dozen children with over 7 women, Pizarro did not submit to similar rebellions of the flesh. As far as we know, he only had 2 mistresses, both of whom were members of the Inca royal family, Quispacisa, Atahualpa's sister, and Cuxiramay Ocllo, Atahualpa's wife and cousin. There's a bit of a grey area as to whether his relationships could be called marriages. They were probably more like concubines, mistress figures, who also acted as confidants. There's not a great deal that suggests he was much of a romantic. Pizarro announced his loose and unofficial marriage to Quispe one day while having dinner with some of his men. He simply sat down next to her and said quite bluntly, quote, "Before you is my wife," then tucked into his food. Pizarro's comrade, Don Alonso Enriquez, said this of the man, quote, "Even after his success, he never ceased to be a very good companion, without vanities or pomp." Pizarro's house, now Lima's government palace, was a modest 2-story wattle and daub structure built on the classic Castilian layout with 2 large courtyards for troops and stables. He certainly gave himself the largest plot in the new city's gridiron layout, but it was much more conservative than later models that came with the future viceroys of Peru. He also took his role as settler and governor of the New World extremely seriously. He believed that Lima was his very own Spanish city and the fruit of his labours. From the city's foundation in January 1535 to his death 6 years later, he played an active role in its urban planning and construction whenever he wasn't at war. According to the chronicles, his daily routine in peacetime would often involve checking up on the construction of the monasteries and churches he had ordered, as well as contemplating the watermills he had built along the Rimac River. These were all funded from his own pocket, not from the royal treasury, just as his men had been subsidized by him and his brothers throughout the conquest. Pizarro's ideas of self-importance contributed to his ambiguous attitude towards the King of Spain. He was certainly respectful of the monarch, and he even refused to fulfill certain requests, even if they were within his power. Pizarro never wanted to lend the impression that he was growing more powerful than the king. There's one anecdote, for example, concerning the royal fifth, or the crown's share of any colonial spoils. On some occasions, when precious metals were being cut and separated for the royal dividend, Pizarro would bend down to pick up any particles that had fallen on the floor, saying that one should even use one's mouth if there were no other way to collect them. On the other hand, Pizarro also felt strongly that his achievements were so great that even the monarch was obligated to honor them. In a letter to his lawyer, Pizarro stated that even if he only had 4 days to live and had disobeyed the king still had to grant him what he had earned. On the few recorded occasions during which Pizarro dabbled in excess or extravagance, it was in the context of his role as a conqueror and settler. For example, let's look at the founding of Lima on the 18th of January 1535. The first townspeople assembled in what would later become the main square, watching as Pizarro and a dozen of his comrades approached them with great solemnity. A pillory, the symbol of law and order, stood at the center of the soon-to-be Plaza Mayor. Pizarro walked over to the pillory, addressing the settlement's former indigenous chief, Taulichusco. With a stern, booming voice, Pizarro asked the chieftain, or curaca, if he objected to the transfer of power. Taulichusco remained silent and motionless, but of course he's not going to say anything, it's either that or death by garrote. Pizarro then turned to his men and, raising his sword to the wood, cut off some of the bark, and thus the City of Kings was founded. Not long after he founded the city, Pizarro carried and laid down the first piece of wood of the first church, as well as the first stone. In another display of public swank, Pizarro reportedly delineated the entire main square with his sword, 140 meters each side. Even today, Lima's classic gridiron layout around the plaza is sometimes referred to as Pizarro's chessboard. With his great sense of duty in his role as conqueror came a very sincere sense of obligation to the Christian God. We're not going to say that the primary motivation for Pizarro or any of the conquistadors was to do God's bidding. It would be completely wrong to omit the more immediate attraction of precious metals, power, and glory. That said, we cannot forget the absolute dominance of Christianity in the lives of 16th century Europeans. 1492 was the grand finale of the Reconquista, the nearly 800-year struggle to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim domination. 1492 was also the same year that the Americas were discovered by Europeans, at least for good. This was really a time in Europe when Christian fervour was at a peak, especially by opposition to Islam. Christians claimed the religious superiority of their own god and his support in fighting foes and proselytizing in his name. Enter the forced conversion of native Amerindians. Worship of any god but a Christian one was seen as the work of the devil. The language of the Reconquista was even transposed to the New World. Pizarro and his comrades would often refer to South America as the Levant, and that it was populated by Turks. This religious fervour accompanied Pizarro in all of his undertakings. His main devotion was to the Virgin Mary, and he claimed that he could not have achieved anything without her guidance. Lima's first church was consecrated to Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception, so, quote, that its gospel be taught and spread among these barbarian peoples who, for now, have been unknowing of its truths and true doctrine and service. Pizarro's will is another example of his piety. In his native Trujillo, he ordered the construction of a church as close as possible to his father's home. It also provided for a hospital, dowries for women of little means, and financing to rescue Christian captives still among the Turks. Pizarro also ordered that a boy in Trujillo go around the town every night reminding people to pray for the souls of those in purgatory. He himself was extremely preoccupied with dying peacefully and putting his soul to rest, a wish you could expect from a conquistador with decades of fighting behind him. He wished the same for his family and companions, as well as the indigenous people who fought alongside him. As we'll discuss later on, Pizarro had remarkable attitudes towards Peruvian Amerindians, which set him apart from most conquistadors. They offer fascinating insights into the workings of his mind, but Pizarro is not a man much celebrated in this day and age, and broadly speaking, with good reason. Pizarro is of course a deeply controversial figure in history. He left behind a legacy of death, misery, slavery, and cultural genocide in South America. All this he did with the prospects of plunder and riches to feed the greed and lust for power of his fellow conquistadors. Pizarro was one of many cruel and violent men who wouldn't flinch from torture, rape, loot, and pillage. The conquest of Peru is littered with stories of atrocities and double crossings towards the indigenous peoples. Pizarro's deception and murder of the Inca Emperor Atahualpa is of course legendary. Pizarro didn't quite fall into the psychopathic sadist category. His brother, Hernando, for example, tortured native chiefs with slow-burning fire and dogs just to obtain gold and silver. But he was nonetheless capable of immense and tyrannical cruelty. Manco Inca was the brother of Atahualpa and Huascar, who supported the Spanish execution of Atahualpa and later helped defeat his general. For his support, he was made a puppet ruler, but he would later turn on the Pizarro brothers after seeing their true colours. When Manco Inca openly rebelled against the Spanish, Pizarro ordered the murder of his wife, Cura Occhio. She was tied to a stake and shot with arrows. The Spanish dumped her body into a river for Manco to find it. Pizarro would also later order the murder of 16 captured curacas, one of whom was burned alive. During the siege of Lima, orchestrated by Manco Inca, word went round that Quispe Sisa, Pizarro's concubine, was a traitor. She was reportedly feeding intelligence to the attackers and sought to escape, taking precious metals with her. Sisa convinced Pizarro that it was her sister, Agro-Pastoral, who was responsible for the conspiracy. Without checking if the accusation was true, Pizarro had Agro-Pastoral garroted. The accusation turned out to be false, and another innocent woman fell victim to Pizarro's vengeful cruelty. The chronicles suggest that Pizarro conceived the lands of the former empire as his own. He had been in the Americas for 30 years, enduring harsh climates and deathly terrains, famine, disease, and war. According to Pizarro, all honours and titles should be awarded to himself, for him to then distribute his wealth and power as he saw fit. It must be remembered, though, that although Pizarro commanded on the ground and fought the main campaigns in Peru, his partner Almagro had masterminded the logistical aspects of the conquest. Had it not been for his organization, the conquest of Peru might have been a very different affair. Nevertheless, Pizarro considered Almagro as his subordinate, not as an equal partner. In Pizarro's eyes, Almagro was welcome to bounty, titles, and estates in Peru, and more than welcome to the mysterious Chile and any land south of Lake Titicaca, but no more. Pizarro's feud with Almagro is useful for us to question just how much of a villain Pizarro really was. He shouldn't be viewed so categorically as completely evil, as literature and legend would have it. He was certainly no saint, but he was far more multi-dimensional than his reputation as a gold-lusting conquistador would afford him. Pizarro is often seen as the double-crosser in his relationship with Almagro. The 1529 Capitulación de Toledo granted Pizarro much greater power and wealth than his partners in spite of the oral pact, it is true. But, according to Dr. Boru, Pizarro actually insisted that the shares of the conquest be equal. It was in fact the royal ministers who denied the granting of equal powers. This was because they wanted to avoid a repeat of an earlier dispute between conquistadors over the founding of Santa Marta in modern-day Colombia. It resulted in the death of the city's main founder, Rodrigo de Bastidas, who was assassinated by his former soldiers. Considering Pizarro's own death, the denial by the royal ministers is certainly ironic. In this video, we don't have time to get into the specifics of the feud between Pizarro and his former friend. Suffice to say, Almagro got the short end of the stick time and time again, outmaneuvered by Pizarro and his brothers, suffering the consequences of greed and poor judgment, or frequently arriving late to enjoy the spoils of the Americas. In any case, even if Almagro was often more at fault, Pizarro, though probably quite insensitive, was even-handed on many occasions. More importantly, much of the real feud was between Almagro and Pizarro's brothers, especially Hernando. Almagro and his followers considered him, as well as Juan and Gonzalo, as arrogant newcomers, riding on their coattails. The feud between the factions would in fact highlight Francisco's humanity. In 1537, after a disastrous 2-year expedition exploring Chile, Almagro and his men arrived in Cusco to find it had been taken by the Pizarrists. Feeling cheated of their sacrifice in Chile, they took the city and imprisoned 2 Pizarro brothers. In doing so, they paved the way to the Battle of Las Salinas the following year, where Almagro's men were defeated at the hands of Hernando Pizarro. Francisco had remained in Lima and had assigned command to his brother. The chronicles say Francisco did not command on the grounds of his old health. However, one historian suspected he couldn't stand the thought of confronting his old friend on the battlefield. It could be a mixture of both, but in any case, Francisco only left for Cusco after he found out about the victory. Almagro, who hadn't fought because he'd taken ill, possibly with syphilis, was arrested and imprisoned. He was then tried and garroted before being decapitated on Cusco's main square. Pizarro only found out about these developments upon arrival. He hadn't wanted this fate for his old friend and companion. It was in fact Hernando, who deeply hated Almagro, who'd made the orders without Francisco knowing. It said Pizarro fell into a great depression from which he wouldn't emerge for another few months. Some of the few records that we have of extreme emotion from Pizarro are in the months that followed, and it's been suggested he succumbed to sincere feelings of guilt that would never leave him. In Pizarro's will, written in 1537 and 1 year before Almagro's death, a completely different side of the Pizarro most would think of is revealed with these words. If Almagro claims the repayment of some forgotten debts, may he be paid whatever he desires, and that whatever spent be accounted for as shared expenses. Almagro's reputation for lavishness and generosity with his men gives this extra importance. In an interesting use of language, Pizarro might also have been willing to concede Almagro's stake in the conquest by ordering to consider as common expense all that each one had invested in, quote, settling and conquering and discovering our land. The Cajamarca episode is perhaps a more famous instance of Pizarro's duplicity. Again, it requires some more nuance. It is perfectly true that in 1532, Atahualpa welcomed Pizarro and his men to the thermal baths of Cajamarca. Atahualpa was then tricked and captured, while his army was defeated by some 168 men. 1 year later, he was double-crossed once again despite paying his ransom. After one of the most scandalous trials in early modern history, he was sentenced to be burned at the stake, but was instead garroted after converting to Christianity in the last minutes of his short life. Now, this is obviously far from excusable. However, Pizarro's biographer tells us that Pizarro was not responsible for the death of the Inca. Responsibility lies with a handful of senior conquistadors, including Almagro, who pushed for the Inca's execution. There isn't a single shred of evidence that Pizarro supported his death. He was the Counselor of War, therefore he oversaw the military trial, but the real judge was an obscure lawyer who had arrived in Cajamarca with Almagro. He proposed the sentence, then the votes were cast in a hasty and improvised trial before the verdict was finally announced. Atahualpa was accused of fratricide, depriving his brother from his rightful claim to the throne, polygamy, wasting of public expenses, idolatry, attempted war against Pizarro and his men, and other trumped-up charges. So, Certainly a tragic miscarriage of justice and with tide-changing consequences, but Pizarro is not our main villain here. And according to his half-brother Pedro, who chronicled the conquest of Peru, Pizarro even cried after the death of Atahualpa and lamented his failure to prevent it. Finally, there's the matter of Pizarro's treatment of natives. The Spanish conquest of Peru is of course a moment in history where indigenous customs, beliefs, language and culture were quashed and supplanted by European ones. Pizarro himself was instrumental in ushering in centuries of colonial exploitation and racial oppression. But to say Pizarro was what we might refer to today as a racist is questionable. Fray Vicente de Valverde, the famous priest present during the capture of Atahualpa, said that Pizarro was, quote, bred in the Indies. You have to remember that Pizarro arrived in the New World in his mid-20s and would go on to spend the rest of his life there. It would be a stretch to say he adopted Inca customs at the expense of Spanish ones. He certainly saw Inca religions as barbarians. However, he appears to have been quite flexible on other matters and could even be a case study for early European assimilation in the Americas. The only concubines or wives he had were indigenous. He would defend the practices and customs of Andean society against the bookish and legalist principles of old Spain. His marriages were arranged according to Inca custom and without Christian ceremony. Unlike the majority of his comrades, he didn't return to Spain after gaining wealth and fame. Though he still had deep roots in his native Trujillo, he wanted to be buried in Lima, in the city's first church. In peacetime, he mingled with people of all ethnicities and standings. In his will, he also requested masses for the, quote, souls of Christian Indians that have died in my service, in said discovery, and in my home. Of course, this is from a man who wants his soul to rest in peace after a warrior's life, so you can't really take everything at face value. The important thing to note here, however, is his belief that Amerindians had souls. Many contemporary Christians couldn't accept this. This was even an important point of contention at the Valladolid debate of the early 1550s. Present was a Dominican friar named Bartolomé de las Casas, now seen as one of the first defenders of human rights. He was a minority voice in advocating for the morality of Amerindians and the need for humane treatment. Yet here, some 15 years earlier, you have the man who often epitomizes the evils of Spanish colonialism in the Americas, saying that Amerindians were capable of having souls. This hardly redeems him for his crimes, but it is worth considering. An anecdote by one of the chroniclers present at the time of the conquest describes an episode when an indigenous servant fell into a river with dangerous rapids. Pizarro apparently plunged in as the current carried away his servant. He was able to pull him out by the hair, risking death to do so. After scrambling to safety, Pizarro was criticized by some of his captains for his recklessness, to which he answered that they did not understand what it was like to care for a servant. Again, these qualities do not necessarily redeem Pizarro. Actions speak louder than words, and legacies speak even louder. However, there is always value in considering the case for the defense, and to look beyond what the traditional narrative tells us about the man. We now turn to some of his more romanticized qualities of leadership, great valiance, which have made Pizarro the stuff of legends. Many of these do bear some firm grounding in reality, others do not. If there's anything unambiguous about Pizarro as a man, it was his singular bravery and ability to inspire his men. First, there's the example set by the man himself. All accounts agree he had great physical strength, as well as fearlessness and tenacity in military matters. During the conquest, he would never shy away from combat. Even in peacetime, one account notes that when any civil unrest broke out in Lima, Pizarro was the first to sprint to the scene without even waiting for his subordinates. It's important to remember that Pizarro was a fighter for most of his life. He spent 2/3 of his life in the Americas, fighting in Hispaniola, Colombia, Panama, Ecuador and Peru. His raison d'etre was fighting. One historian has even suggested to the point of obsession. But he was also adept at boosting the morale of his men in times of great adversity. Bear in mind that many of these men spent years enduring unimaginable climates, unforgiving terrain, disease, thirst and starvation, not to mention uncertainty, paranoia and great fear. Part of his appeal as a commander was that he himself was a foot soldier. He had horses of his own, but he chose to fight on foot because he was better at it. This might be because of his humble upbringing, but it's more likely as a result of 20 years fighting in jungle conditions in Central America and the Caribbean. In any case, you can imagine the impact this had on morale and soldiers seeing their commander fighting on the ground as an equal. His seniority in the Americas also commanded him great respect, and we have written testimonies of his soldiers revealing just how devoted they were to him. The episode on the Isla del Gallo is one of the better-known instances of Pizarro's inspiring strength of will. After the fiasco of the Colombian campaigns and the orders to abort the mission, the chronicles tell us Pizarro drew a line in the sand with his sword and said to his men the following words, now etched in history. "Those on that side of the line can go back to Panama and be poor. Those on this side can come to Peru and be rich. Let the good Castilian choose his path." 13 men were convinced enough to cross that line and stay on with Pizarro, making history as the famous 13. Extraordinary patience and mental resilience come to mind here. Pizarro earned the respect from his men that would allow them to endure the extreme hardship of later episodes. Not a single attempt on his life took place during the long military expeditions, an important consideration given the temperaments of contemporary conquistadors. But now let us turn to the limitations of his leadership. Just because he was a brave and inspiring commander does not mean he was always a skilled one. Several chroniclers note that while astute, he was often indecisive and slow in reaching decisions. Pizarro also apparently had a habit of saying no to things without properly reflecting on them. He's been criticized for being stubborn and uncreative with regard to military tactics. In Peru, for example, he would reuse the tactics he had applied in the Central American campaigns, where disease and hunger were the main obstacles, not efficient and standing Inca armies. During the siege of Cusco in Manco Inca's rebellion, for example, he sent out 30-man columns, one after the next, each of which was ambushed and massacred in mountain passes. As discussed earlier, he was hopeless at the logistical side of the campaigns, being basically dependent on Almagro's recruitment and fundraising abilities for Cajamarca, and later the political talents of his half-brother Hernando. As governor, Pizarro was fairly mediocre. He wasn't completely incompetent, out of his depth, or constantly overwhelmed. Let's just say politics weren't really for him. He wasn't incisive enough, knowledgeable enough to lead in that way, and he'd never exactly learned how to do it. His brother Hernando was much more capable in that regard. Pizarro respected Hernando because he was both a fighter and a politician. He considered his brother as the heir to the Peruvian governorate and a true son to their father. For this reason, Hernando was twice sent to Spain to deliver the royal fifth. As you can imagine, Pizarro's illiteracy was also a big obstacle and lifelong reminder of his plebeian background. On his first voyage, it said Pizarro had tried to learn how to read, but that frustration and impatience got the better of him. This practical handicap made him reliant on his secretaries. Even toward the end of his life, he could barely sign his name. He usually just drew 2 lines and his secretary signed between them. In his will, he insisted that his children learn how to read and write. He expressed he wanted his son, Gonzalo, to learn grammar and Latin, therefore might have felt strongly about his offspring achieving what he never could. The chronicles describe an interesting incident during the time Atahualpa was held captive by Pizarro and his men between 1532 and 1533. Atahualpa was apparently fascinated by the Spaniards' ability to read and write and considered it to be innate. To verify this, he asked one of the Spanish guards to write the name of his god, presumably Inti, the Inca sun god, on his thumbnail. Atahualpa then asked several Spaniards to read it aloud. Shortly thereafter, Pizarro came in and Atahualpa asked him to read it. Pizarro had to confess that he couldn't. From that moment on, Atahualpa realized that it was, in fact, an acquired accomplishment, something which even some of Pizarro's coarsest men had achieved before their governor. Chroniclers suggest that Atahualpa's previous respect for Pizarro plummeted after this incident. Finally, in considering the limitations of Pizarro's abilities as a commander, we had Pizarro's recklessness. For this, we turn to the man's final years as governor in Lima. The aging conquistador's years of war meant that when peacetime finally settled in the late 1530s, he didn't really know what to do with himself. Early colonial society didn't involve an awful lot of ruling. Rather, he was more preoccupied with the construction of Lima. A man with little taste for culture or the arts, he would also spend many of his days and evenings gambling and playing games and sports. He even had a ball court installed in his house. But while Pizarro was reaping the gains of his lifelong endeavors, a plot against his life was being hatched. The scattered supporters of Almagro were rallying together, bitter at the execution of their former leader and the perceived betrayal by the Pizarrists. Hernando, who was in Spain at the time, had earlier suggested that the remaining Almagres be separated and forced to live in different locations. Pizarro clearly didn't take much notice of this warning. Diego the Younger, Almagro's son, even lived in Lima. Right under Pizarro's nose, his house had been turned into a refuge for the conspirators. More signs emerged about a brewing conspiracy. On the 25th of June, 1541, Pizarro's advisors told him they'd received eyewitness reports that the conspirators were acquiring weapons, and that an attempt on his life was imminent. He laughed this off as a rumour spread by Peruvians, or else by Spaniards interested in some kind of reward for the information. But the threat was very real. The 26th of June, 1541, was a Sunday. On the advice of his followers, Pizarro agreed not to go to church for Sunday Mass, just as a precautionary measure. A priest instead came to his house to read Mass. When this was over, around 11 o'clock in the morning, Pizarro was joined by a group of about 20 people, his advisors and commanders, soldiers and servants. While they were all gathered together in the dining room, one of the pages burst through the doors, yelling that the conspirators were on their way to kill Pizarro. Within moments, all of his men fled the scene, except for only 2 of his most faithful commanders and 2 servants. As Pizarro ran for his armor and sword, he instructed his commander Chavez to barricade the door and stall the assassins. Instead of keeping the door blocked, Chavez tried to parley with the assassins and was cut down on the spot. The assassins stormed the dining room and were confronted by Pizarro's commander and half-brother de Alcántara. Pizarro's pages were still helping him fasten his armor before the governor came to his companion's aid, foregoing his armor altogether. He darted towards them and entered the fight. Martin fell from a wound to the chest, then the pages were killed, and Pizarro was left to fight alone. He slayed one Almagrist after the next, to the point where it seemed the governor could well have survived the attack. Then, deciding it was time to act decisively, one of the assassins pushed one of his comrades onto Pizarro. Pizarro's sword thrust through him, and he stumbled back from the force of the weight. At this point, all of the surviving assassins encircled Pizarro. As they closed in on him, Pizarro took wounds all over his body, with one to the jugular. Yet he still carried on fighting. When blood loss and weakness overcame him, he collapsed. Barely conscious, he raised his right hand to his neck before drawing a cross on the floor with his own blood. As Pizarro moved his head over the cross to kiss it, one of the assassins reached over for an earthen vase and delivered the final blow. It is beyond any doubt that Pizarro's bravery knew no bounds, but his death was avoidable. He was reckless and proud in his final days. William Prescott suggests Pizarro could have allied with the Almagres after the defeat of their leader, showed them benevolence and magnanimity, and put an end to the infighting of the conquistadors. Instead, their continued challenge and resistance to his title, one which he considered as his right, was beyond pardon. He paid the greatest price with his life. Pizarro is a difficult man to uncloak. His illiteracy doesn't help us much, and we must rely on chronicles, which are often biased, or historic accounts written much later, full of their own biases or romanticisms. He was a bastard with humble beginnings, but hardly typical of the lower classes, given his connection to the Pizarro lineage. He would follow in his father's footsteps as a fighter, imbued with the crusading Christianity and racial paternalism of 16th century Europe. He was a serious man, deeply pious, brave, and resistant to vanity or the pomp that comes with the nobility. Quite the contrary, he was relatively plebeian in his tastes and habits, nor was he fussy with his company. He was a warrior at heart, living and dying by the sword. From a lifetime of fighting, he conceived himself as a true conqueror, not only discovering but settling new lands as an ambassador to his homeland and to God. One wonders how Pizarro would have reflected on his own rise to power. He went from illiterate mercenary to mayor of Panama, then from governor of Peru, essentially wedded to Incan royalty, to a Marquis, each milestone with incrementally shorter time lapses. That's quite a character arc for an unlettered bastard. He was certainly a flawed man, and he left behind a legacy deserving of condemnation. However, he's not just the one-dimensional villain of legend and literature, but a complex individual who left us with ambiguous motivations, conflicting actions, and a personality shrouded in intrigue.